All right, welcome back. Well, we are looking at Where Did the Book of Mormon Come From? Part 4. And so I just want to give you a review of our timeline that we were looking at. We were looking at when Spalding died, which was 1816. And then 1830, we saw that the Book of Mormon was published. And then we see is the case that there's that 14-year gap, which is very important, as we'll see later on. There's missionary activity taking place. 1833, we saw that D.P. Holbert had been a convert to the LDS Church, but he had left it, and we seen that he was basically returning to Conneaut, Ohio, and he was going to be introduced to more witnesses who testified of the same facts, and he also went to some other places to obtain testimonies. So Henry Lake was a partner at a forge, and we see that here's what Holbert, when he took his statement, here's what Henry Lake had to say. I left the state of New York late in year 1810, arrived at this place about the 1st of January following. Soon after my arrival, I formed a co-partnership with Solomon Spalding for the purpose of rebuilding a forge, which he had commenced a year or two before. He very frequently read to me from a manuscript which he was writing, which he entitled The Manuscript Found, which he represented as being found in this town. I spent many hours in hearing him read said writings and became well acquainted with its contents. He wished me to assist him in getting his production printed, alleging that a book of that kind would meet with a rapid sale. I designed doing so, but the forge not meeting our anticipations, we failed in business when I declined having anything to do with the publication of the book. This book represented the American Indians as descendants of the lost tribes, gave an account of their leaving Jerusalem, their contentions, and wars which were many and great. One time, when he was reading to me the tragic account of Laban, which is a very important detail, which is found in 1st Nephi, first few chapters of the book, I pointed out to him what I considered an inconsistency, which he promised to correct, but by referring to the Book of Mormon, I find to my surprise that it stands there just as he read it to me then. Some months ago, I borrowed the Golden Bible, which is also called the Book of Mormon, put it into my pocket, carried it home, thought no more of it, and about a week after, my wife found the book in my coat pocket as it hung up and commenced reading it aloud as I lay upon the bed. She had not read 20 minutes till I was astonished to find the same passages in it that Spalding had read to me more than 20 years before from his manuscript found, and since I have more fully examined the said Golden Bible, and have no hesitation in saying that the historical part of it is principally, if not wholly, taken from the manuscript found, I well recollect telling Mr. Spalding that the so frequent use of the words, and it came to pass, not came to pass, rendered it ridiculous. And I would agree with him. Spalding left here in 1812, and I furnished him the means to carry him to Pittsburgh, where he said he would get the book printed and pay me. But I never heard any more from him or his writings till I saw them in the Book of Mormon. Henry Lake. John Miller, who was a co-worker with Spalding on the forge, and he lived in Springfield, Pennsylvania. Hobart took his statement down. In the year 1811, I was in the employ of Henry Lake and Solomon Spalding at Conneaut, engaged in rebuilding a forge. While there, I boarded and lodged in the family of said Spalding for several months. I was soon introduced to the manuscript of Spalding, perused them as often as I had leisure. He had written 2 or 3 books or pamphlets on different subjects, but that which more particularly drew my attention was one he called the Manuscript Found. From this, he would frequently read some humorous passages to the company present. It purported to be the history of the first settlement of America before discovered by Columbus. He brought them off from Jerusalem under their leaders, detailing their travels by land and water, their manners, customs, laws, wars. He said that he designed it as a historical novel, and that in after years it would be believed by many people as much as the history of England. He soon after failed in business and told me he should retire from the den of his creditors, finish his book, and have it published, which would enable him to pay his debts and support his family. He soon after removed to Pittsburgh, as I understood. I have recently examined the Book of Mormon, finding the writings of Solomon Spalding from beginning to end, but mixed up with scripture and other religious matter, which I did not meet within the manuscript found. Many of the passages in the Book of Mormon book are verbatim from Spalding, and others in part. Names of Nephi, Lehi, Moroni, in fact, all the principal names are brought fresh to my recollection by the Gold Bible. When Spalding divested his history of its fabulous names by a verbal explanation, he landed his people near the Straits of Darien, which I am very confident he called Zarahemla. They were marched about that country for a length of time in which wars and great bloodshed ensued. He brought them across North America in a northeast direction. John N. Miller. Artemaus Cunningham, creditor to Spalding. He lived in Perry, Geauga County. In the month of October 1811, I went from the township of Madison to Conneaut for the purpose of securing a debt due me from Solomon Spalding. I tarried with him nearly 2 days for the purpose of accomplishing my object, which I was finally unable to do. I found him destitute of the means of paying his debts. His only hope of ever paying his debts appeared to be upon the sale of a book, which he had been writing. He endeavored to convince me from the nature and character of the work that it would meet with a ready sale. Before showing me his manuscripts, he went into a verbal relations of its outlines, saying that it was a fabulous or romantic history of the first settlement of this country, and as it purported to have been a record found buried in the earth or in a cave, he had adopted the ancient or scripture style of writing. He then presented his manuscripts, when we sat down and spent a good share of the night in reading them and conversing upon them. I well remember the names of Nephi, which appear to be the principal hero of the story. The frequent repetition of the phrase "I Nephi" I recollect as distinctly as though it was but yesterday, although the general features of the story have passed from my memory, though through the lapse of 22 years. He attempted to account for the numerous antiquities which are found upon this continent, and remarked after this generation had passed away, his account of the first inhabitants of America would be considered as authentic as any other history. The Mormon Bible I have partially examined and am fully of the opinion that Solomon Spalding had written its outlines before he left Conneaut. So, was D.P. Hulbert the originator of the Spalding theory since he took down the affidavits, as Winchester asserts? And I'm glad you asked that question. So let's do some more deep diving into history. As you can see, Hulbert took down all these statements from Henry Lake, from all these other people, as we have encountered in our last video and in this video. So let's focus on that matter, if we might, about whether he was the originator of this theory or not. So, according to Saints Unscripted YouTube channel, this is what he has to say in a 30-second to 1 minute, 18-second mark. And evidently, he just didn't do his. Either he just didn't find other information, which I presume to be what he did. So the first person to propose the Spalding reading theory was a guy named Philastus Hulbert, soon after he had been excommunicated from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In fact, he was excommunicated from 3 different churches that we know of, all for issues dealing with immorality. But anyway, after he was excommunicated from our faith, he dedicated himself to destroying Joseph Smith's name and character. And that's true. He did dedicate himself to that. In his travels, he obtained several affidavits smearing Joseph's name. Some of them come from neighbors and family of a man named Solomon Spalding, a former preacher and unpublished author who died in 1816. Now, remember what we said about our timeline? Spalding died in 1816. 14 years later, the Book of Mormon comes out. Missionary activity takes place after that. And you'll remember in 1833 that Hulbert was converted to the LDS faith. But we got to go back a year later to 1832 to these LDS missionaries named Hyde and Smith. This is very important. This is 1 year before Hulbert comes along. So what do we want to say about this? Well, let's go to what Hyde wrote down in his diary. He says, and remember that Hyde actually was the partner who made charges against Hulbert. So here's what he says in his diary, February 9, 1832. went back into the village and preached in the evening to a large congregation, warned them faithfully of the evils, spent the night again with Mr. Holcomb. And then the next day, left Mr. Holcomb's and went down to Kingsville, 6 miles, and held a meeting at Mr. Woodbury's. Small congregation, but gave good attention. Something excited. 1832, next day. Left Mr. Woodbury's house, went on to Salem, found some friendly and some enemies. Some, I think, will go to Zion. Now, this is interesting because Salem is another name for conduit, friends. February 12th, 1832. Sunday morning, went on near Salem village to a Christian congregation, attended meeting with them, heard them exhort, pray. At the close of the meeting, arose and told them our mission and desired permission to preach in the evening. And after a little conversation among them, they unanimously agreed we should preach, attend a crowded and attentive audience. They requested we should tarry and preach again. Accordingly, made an appointment for next evening, tarried all night with a Mr. Saltrill, kindly entertained. And then the next day, visited 2 or 3 families in the vicinity of Salem, held a meeting in the evening, a large and attentive congregation. Some appeared to be excited. Sold 2 books of Mormon. Tarried all night with Colonel Fifield. Now, just to give you an idea of what we're dealing with here, I want to show you the map. So you can see Conneaut up there in the northern part, and there's Kingsville, right? So remember, Hyde is the one who made charges against Hulbert, but this is a year. But remember, this is a year earlier. So he started in. We see his diary in Kingsville, and then he visited 2 or 3 families in the vicinity of Salem. Okay, well, Salem is where Conneaut is close to. Now notice this. He says, Sunday morning went on near Salem village to a Christian congregation. Why did some in Salem, or what we call Conneaut, get excited? Now, of course, I know this is a little bit of speculation on what he said about getting excited, but we have to remember that Spalding did live there. And remember that Spalding frequently read his material to them. And some friends or acquaintances or neighbors who knew Spalding had attended the meeting held by the LDS missionaries. And one was named Aaron Wright, and one of the Conneaut witnesses that we know about. Now, we know this because of what was discovered in the 1980s. So at Farkas, he made a great discovery in the New York Public Library in 1914 Bulletin section, News of the Month Gifts. And of the gifts received by the library during the month of May, the 2 following are especially worthy of mention. From Mrs. Hiram Lake of Conneaut, Ohio, came 2 manuscripts of interest in connection with the history of Mormonism. An agreement between Solomon Spalding and Henry Lake dated March 8, 1811, and an unsigned letter dated Conneaut, December 31st, 1833, relating to the recognition by the writer of the identity between entries of the Book of Mormon and Solomon Spalding manuscript. So, this unsigned letter, we know it to belong to Aaron Wright, and this is why. So, there was a draft that was personally dictated by Wright to Hulbert. And then the time frame would be that Hulbert had already gotten a affidavit statement from Wright in August of 1833. Hulbert would make a trip to New York, and he would get affidavits from others, neighbors who knew Joseph Smith and his character. And he was going to, his goal was to obtain the manuscript of Solomon Spalding. Well, then he comes back and he shows Aaron Wright, is this the manuscript of Solomon Spalding? And Aaron Wright said, no, that's not it. There is another one. I mean, he recognized it as Solomon Spaulding's writing, but it was not manuscript found. So Hulbert returned to Wright to obtain another personal witness testimony on December 31st, 1833. So this is several months after August, after taking that first affidavit statement. Hulbert left the unsigned draft copy, obviously with Wright, who left it in an account book, and then finally somehow came into the hands of Mrs. Hiram Lake, which was Hiram Lake's widow. Now, Hulbert also obtained affidavits, but they did not survive, and they probably sadly burned in the fire at the newspaper office. And that manuscript story was not the same story from Oliver Smith, John Miller, and others. So that's part of our evidence package. Is when the first manuscript was discovered in 1884 in Honolulu, it had a statement written on the back that said, "The writings of Solomon Spaulding proved by Aaron Wright, Oliver Smith, John Miller, and others. The testimonies of the above gentlemen are now in my possession. D.P. Hulbert," his signature. And here is that. Now, December 29th through the 30th of 1833, Wright and others tell Hulbert that Spaulding informed him that the unfinished Roman story, which we call manuscript story, the one that was discovered in Honolulu, Hawaii, I tell you that, well, yes, later on it was discovered in Hawaii in 1884, but it was earlier, so to speak, discovered in a trunk in Massachusetts, as we'll see. So it had been written, this one manuscript discovered in the trunk had been written by him for his own amusement. And evidently Solomon Spaulding must have come to the knowledge of he had come to himself and said, you know what, this manuscript is not what I want. So he switched gears and he began writing a different story, giving a fictional history of the first settlement of America. And he went farther back with dates and writing in the old scriptural style, which fits, and it came to pass, and it came to pass, which, interestingly enough, is not found in the first manuscript in order to appear ancient. And after obtaining the new affidavits from Connewitt, we know that Hulbert returned to the Kirtland area. So, looking at our timeline now, 1816, Spaulding died. 1830, Book of Mormon is published. Then, with Hyde and Smith, the Mormon missionaries, that was 1832 when they had visited that area of Connewitt. So, now what we want to do is look at 1831. And that's 2 years before Hulbert came on the scene. So here's a second piece of evidence that was written in the Cleveland Advertiser. Notice that, February 15, 1831. Now notice what it says. The Painesville Telegraph of this morning has the particulars of the acceptance of a challenge by Thomas Campbell, given by a noted mountebank by the name of Elder Rigdon, which is Sidney Rigdon, who has flourished in and about the openings for the last few years, and to the no small wonderment of all the old women round about that country, to test the validity of the doctrine contained in the Book of Mormon. It is something singular that the subject should have created such a stir. The editor of the Telegraph has opened his paper to discussion of its merits and demerits. It goes on to write, Rigdon was formerly a disciple of Campbell's, who said was sent out to make proselytes, but it's probable he thought he should find it more advantageous to operate on his own capital, therefore wrote as is believed in the Book of Mormon, and commenced his pilgrimage in the town of Kirtland, which was represented as one of the extreme points of the Holy Land. The good people of that country were wont to take a different notice of nuances by placing them astride a rail, accompanied with the music of kettle drums, tin pans, pumpkin vines to the tune of Over the Hills and Far Away. Now, notice there's not a connection between Spaulding and the Book of Mormon, but there is a connection between Sidney Rigdon and the Book of Mormon. So, February 15th, 1831. And then there's a third piece of evidence. James Gordon Bennett, a newspaper journalist. Here's a portrait of him. And he wrote, August 7th, 1831. Mormonism, Ode Smith, Joseph Smith Sr. was a healer, a grand storyteller, very glib, was a vendor, made gingerbread and buttermints. Young Smith, Joseph Jr., was careless, idle, indolent fellow, 22 years old, brought up to live by his wits, which means a broker of small wants. Martin Harris was a hardy, industrious farmer of Palmyra with some money, could speak off the Bible by heart. Henry or Sidney Rigdon, now notice he gets his name right by calling him Sidney Rigdon, a parson and general, smart fella. He is the author of the Bible, the Book of Mormon. They dig first for money. Great Millie Hill, Dr. Mitchell examined them and compared them with other hieroglyphics, thought them very curious, and they were the characters of a nation now extinct, which he named. Harris returned to Anthon, who put some questions to him and got angry with Harris. Very interesting, right? What was written down in his diary. But then we have this written down. So Bennett discusses Joseph Smith and his activities, and then he reports on what he calls Rigdon, which is he misspells Rigdon's name wrong. And after the lapse of some weeks, the expedition was completed, and the famous Ohio man made his appearance among them. This recruit was the most cunning, intelligent, and odd of the whole. He had been a preacher of almost every religion, a teacher of all sorts of morals. He was a perfectly affat with every species of prejudice, folly, or fanaticism which governs the mass of enthusiasts. In the course of his experience, he had attended all sorts of camp meetings, prayer meetings, anxious meetings, and revival meetings. He knew every turn of the human mind in relation to these matters. He had a superior knowledge of human nature, considerable talent, great plausibility, knew how to work the passions exactly as Cape Cod sailors knows how to work a whale ship. His name, I believe, is Henry Rigdon or Ringdon or some such word. And sadly, notice again, Bennett gets the name wrong. In the face of this heel, the money diggers renewed their work with fresh ardor, Ringdon partly uniting with them in their operations. So that was in part one of what he wrote as an article for a newspaper. And that was August 31st, 1831. So notice what he says in his second one. So this is a month later, September 1st, 1831. It was during this state of public feeling with which the money diggers of Ontario County, by the suggestions of the ex-preacher from Ohio, thought of turning their digging concerning into a religious plot and thereby have a better chance of working upon the credulity and ignorance of their associates and the neighborhood. Money and a good living might be gotten this way. It was given out that visions had appeared to Joe Smith, that a set of golden plates on which was engraved the Book of Mormon, enclosed in an iron chest, was deposited somewhere in the hill I have mentioned. People laughed at the first intimation of the story, but the Smiths and Rigdon persisted in its truth. They began also to talk very seriously, to quote Scripture, to read the Bible, to be contemplative, and assume that grave studied character which so easily imposes on ignorant and superstitious people. So, what I want you to notice is there's no connection to Spalding again, but to Rigdon. Now, when we put all of this together, something interesting starts to form. So, you remember 1816? Probably know these dates by now. Spalding died. 1830, Book of Mormon is published. And then you have that missionary activity taking place, of which we know about two of them. So 1832, we had Hyde and Smith, who went to Conneaut, and there was a connection made between the townspeople of Conneaut, and they saw that, hey, there's a connection between the writings of Spalding and the Book of Mormon. And then, if you jump back 1 year earlier, there was James Gordon Bennett, who made a connection between Sidney Rigdon and the Book of Mormon. But also we have the Cleveland Advertiser, which also made the same connection between Sidney Rigdon and the Book of Mormon. Now that's interesting. You have those connections, two distinct groups of people, those in Conneaut, but then you got people in New York like Bennett and even in Ohio, in Cleveland Advertiser, in Ohio. So the question we have to ask ourselves, is there a connection between the two? And what's interesting is you'll remember one specific detail that they said. The witnesses stated that the manuscript found did not contain was religious material or scripture. Well, who added it? And I would suggest to you that we have the man, Sidney Rigdon. And we'll talk more about him later on in our videos. But you can see the connections that we're already beginning to make. So the questions we have to ask ourselves: who copied or stole the manuscript? What happened to Spalding's manuscript found? Well, we are, I believe, getting closer to answering those questions, but we still have a lot more to answer, unfortunately. So the new question that we need to ask is there a connection between Solomon Spalding and Sidney Rigdon? And so, I hate to tell you this, but you'll have to join me next time for the next upcoming video. Thank you very much. And I'm glad, and I hope that you'll tune in soon. Thank you for watching, and thank you for listening.